The Canadian consensus on immigration appears to be crumbling. New polling suggests a number of Canadians who say the federal government is accepting too many immigrants has spiked in recent years. And among Conservative voters, the swing is even more dramatic. The CBC's JP Tasker is here to break down this data for us. So, JP, what are Canadians telling pollsters about immigration levels?
Well, most Canadians say the government is letting in too many immigrants, according to a new poll from Environics Institute. Nearly 6 in 10 Canadians now say that immigration is too high. And there's been what the firm calls a sea change in public opinion on this topic. Let's show our viewers this chart here. So you see over the last 25 years, most Canadians were relatively happy with immigration levels. You know, zooming in on 2020, only 27% of survey respondents at the time said there were too many immigrants coming in. Well, fast forward 5 years and that number has now spiked to 56%. So there's been a 30-point swing in a relatively short period of time in terms of the number of people who say there's too much immigration to Canada. Of course, that period coincides with the Liberals kind of turbocharging immigration, adding more than 1 million people a year for 3 years in a row in that post-pandemic period. Although the number of newcomers has sort of flatlined, population growth has stagnated this year, there is still high levels of public opposition to immigration, despite some of the changes that we're seeing around us as fewer international students and TFWs come into this country.
Yeah, you can see it right here, right? The post-COVID years just boom as they reopened the gates, let people into the country. That's when the sentiment started to change. And what's interesting, JP, as stark as that is, the surge in opposition or discontent with immigration, it's even more notable amongst people who vote Conservative.
Yeah, that's right. More than 80% of Conservative voters now say that there is too much immigration to this country. That's the highest figure that Environics has ever recorded in the 48 years that they've been tracking Canadian views on immigration, the highest among any demographic group they've ever recorded. So let's bring up this graphic. As you can see, 25 years ago, federal voting intentions didn't really tell you a lot about how people felt about immigration, right?
Look at this, right?
But look at the end of that graphic there. Yeah, I mean, like 25 years ago, it was kind of clumped together there. NDP, Liberal, Conservatives, there was all, there was some opposition among all of those sort of voters. But when you fast forward to now, there's a huge difference. 82% of Conservatives now say there's too many coming in. For the Liberals, 40%. For the NDP voters, 30%. So there's been really a huge uptick among all voters. The consensus around immigration is crumbling, but you really see that stark increase among Conservatives in particular. And that might explain why we're starting to see a messaging shift from Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre, right? He is reading the tea leaves. He's seeing how the party base is responding to this issue, and he has been calling for a hard cap on immigration. He has called for the dismantling of the temporary foreign worker program. He has called for a crackdown on what he calls bogus asylum claims. And also we're hearing from immigration critic Michelle Rempel-Garner, who also wants to revisit birthright citizenship. So what was once the third rail of Canadian politics is really not that anymore, as public opinion really takes a turn.
Okay, JP, thank you so much. That's the CBC's JP Tasker. You read more on this tomorrow morning at CBCNews.ca/politics. All right, let's get some more perspective on these numbers. Jason Kenney is a former federal minister of immigration and a former premier of Alberta. Jason Kenney, it's good to see you again. Thanks for being here, sir.
Be here.
So we've talked a lot about the fraying consensus on immigration in this country, and Environics puts it right at 56% of Canadians overall saying that too many immigrants are coming in. What do you make of that shift? Are you concerned about that shift in sentiment?
Well, I don't think it's really a shift. We've been seeing numbers like this for some time. And even when I was immigration minister and we had a system much better under control, if you actually looked under the hood of the data, you saw, I think, opposition to very high levels of immigration. That's not at all unusual. And I do not think it is a reflection of xenophobia or racism. In fact, pretty consistently, you see that new Canadians, first-generation immigrants, tend to be the most skeptical of or opposed to very high levels, because those are the folks most affected by problems like scarcity of housing, scarcity of healthcare, underemployment, and they're also folks who are most sensitive to, let's call it, irregular and illegal immigration. So I think I'll be blunt, David. I think perhaps the single biggest failure and worst legacy of the Trudeau administration was taking the broadest pro-immigration consensus in the democratic world and turning it upside down.
Yeah, if you dig into the numbers, Environics comes to the conclusion that increasing emphasis is placed on the system being poorly managed by the government. It has to do with some of the issues you mentioned there, pressure on housing prices and availability, the impact of jobs in the economy, that essentially too many people too fast without a clear plan. What's interesting, though, Jason Kenney, is when you look at how that 56% is divided amongst people in their partisan voting. It's much higher with conservatives. The number is over 80% think there's too much immigration, and only about half that for the Liberals and the NDP. When you see a number polarized like that between partisan identity, do you worry about where that could go?
Potentially, although I don't think it's entirely surprising. I mean, one of the reasons people would migrate to the Conservatives because they believe the Liberals have completely screwed up the immigration system, created a housing crisis partly through, tripling population growth, and other associated social challenges. So I think it's a reflection of the response to all of that. Again, I would emphasize, David, I would not infer from that anything like xenophobia because. I think there's pretty good evidence. We don't yet have the Canada Elections Survey back, the post-election study, but I think there's pretty good anecdotal evidence based on riding by riding results that the Conservatives won at least a plurality of the vote of new Canadians in many parts of the country. I think probably in East Asian communities, probably in some of the South Asian communities. So listen, let me just put it bluntly. If you go and just do streeters in Brampton or Surrey or Richmond Hill, majority immigrant areas, and ask people about this, I tell you what they say to me, which is that Trudeau wrecked the system. Too many people have come in all at once. They'll particularly focus on the large volume of non-permanent residents. So again, I think this is a real issue all across Canada. It's not like it's some. I wouldn't want to caricature this as some sort of rural, old stock Canadian reaction to immigration. It's broader than that. In fact, I was the only immigration minister ever to include Indigenous communities in the department's annual levels plan consultation. And it may not surprise you to know that the Canadians who seem least hospitable to high levels of immigration are Indigenous Canadians.
Yeah, certainly there's no intention here to try to portray this as a xenophobia thing, though there is some data that show it is occurrent with some people. But you talk about like Brampton and Surrey, where the Conservatives did well with South Asian diaspora voters in particular. A lot of what you hear from the campaigns is a lot of second generation and third generation, very worried about affordability, crime, the cost of housing, which are sort of things that cut across the entire population. But you do get some numbers that give me some pause. And I'm not trying to attribute this to any type of Canadian, but 36% agree that immigrants increase the level of crime, and 39% that the country accepts too many from racial minority groups. There is a whiff of xenophobia in that kind of data, and you worry about what that could mean if that holds or grows from there. Jason Kenney, what are your thoughts when you see data like that?
Well, you're right to have that concern, which is why in my 5 years as Canada's immigration minister, I used to say every day that we ought not to take for granted the broad cross-partisan pro-immigration consensus in Canada, that we had to be deliberate about maintaining it. And that required keeping levels of intake at manageable levels so that we could properly integrate people, both economically and socially. And we had to ensure the system had fair rules because wherever, David, we've seen widespread illegal or irregular migration, be it abuse of the asylum system or the situation in the United States and Europe, with illegal boat crossings, et cetera, wherever you see that, you see the public turn against immigration. And that becomes fertile soil for the actual xenophobes to divide along racial and ethnic lines. So that's why what's happened in the past several years was so, I think, dangerous. And that's why we need to get back to significantly reduce the intake, reform the programs to ensure that, like the asylum and other programs, weed out fraud, And because to do that is to save the immigration system itself and to ensure that we have a positive model of pluralism for the future of Canada.
So this is something with the government's under new management, as you're well aware. There has been a shift on the immigration policy front by Mark Carney and his ministry. And they are changing a bunch of things to try to keep essentially the rate of population growth at effectively zero. Now, the knock-on effect, it's been havoc in the post-secondary system across the country as they lose the revenue stream from cuts in international students. But when you look at measures like that, how do you see that maybe, can that repair some of the lost confidence in immigration and rebuild some of the consensus from what we've seen in the last number of years?
Well, yeah, there's certainly look, there's been the introduction of some realism in the last year or so. And so some of the constraints on the flow of non-permanent residents, students, foreign workers will help. I actually think, I'm on the C.D. Howe Institute's immigration policy panel, and we issued, I think, a very thoughtful report recently, which said it's not just about the numbers, it's also about the nature of people we select. Unfortunately, because of the huge number of low-skilled non-permanent residents they admitted recently, that's an enormous population. We're talking millions of people, plus those who are out of status, who are trying to jam into the permanent immigration streams, crowding out the high human capital candidates that used to characterize Canada's immigration policy success in the past. So yes, to reducing levels, to manageable, to be more aligned with the availability of housing and public services, but also getting back to a high human capital model of immigration is critical.
How do you calibrate that, just as a final point? Because you've seen it at the provincial level as a former premier, where you need certain immigration streams to help fill skill shortages in the economy, and also as an immigration minister, and where things are now. The rebuilding of the public trust without exacerbating the stress of population growth, but still fitting the needs, right? Because if we're going to build houses and do all these other things, we don't have all of that here at home.
Well, I hear that. I laugh whenever I hear this argument that to deal with the housing crisis, we need to admit huge numbers of new immigrants to build houses. I mean, this is just a self-defeating circular argument. And by the way, I got to tell you, if you actually look at the skill set of the millions of people admitted above normal levels by the Trudeau government, not a hell of a lot of framers and carpenters in that population, which is precisely my point. What they did was to heavily tilt intake with students and foreign workers towards low-skilled folks, which is one of the things driving the precipitous decline in per capita GDP in Canada. So I'm sorry if this sounds self-congratulatory, but we launched, when I was minister, the Express Entry, which was a new and improved version of the old point system, which was hugely successful. Typically, candidates coming through that permanent residence would be making higher than average earnings after 10 years in Canada once they got their footing here. We know what criteria lead to that success. When we launched it, I think we were selecting candidates with about 1,200 points out of 1,300 possible. Trudeau's government took that down to 75 out of 1,300 points. Right. That's how precipitously they reduced the threshold for human capital. We know what works. Let's get back to it.
Okay. Jason Kenney, we're out of time, but we appreciate your time. That's Jason Kenney, former federal Minister of Immigration and former Premier of Alberta. Thank you, sir.
Thanks, Dave.
Some new polling suggests a pretty dramatic swing in attitudes about immigration here in Canada. The poll from Environics found more than half of Canadians believe the federal government is letting in too many immigrants. That's after a spike in negative sentiments from 2022 to 2024. Before then, most Canadians would say there wasn't too much immigration. There is a huge disparity, though, when you break down the numbers by party, as more than 80% of Conservative supporters say there's too much immigration. That's compared to 40% of Liberal supporters and just 30% of NDP supporters. Let's bring back the power panel on that. Vandana Cotter is here, so is Kate Harrison, Brad Levine, and Tonda McCharles. Vandana, a lot of this change happened when your former government was increasing immigration numbers post the lockdowns of COVID. The post-secondary system at the provincial level was hungry for students, relying on them for cash. We can see maybe the consequences of those policies. What do you make of these numbers?
Yeah, I think it's a few things. I think one, it is the challenges that the government has faced when it comes to immigration. And as you mentioned, in terms of post-secondary institutions and how are they using students, and just the need for temporary foreign workers or companies saying they needed that during COVID. I think there's also, we just look at the culture shift in the United States and how that impacts Canada. And I think it's also, social media. I think social media also shares a lot of misinformation about immigrants. and I see them on reels, I see them sent to me about, look at what's happening, without any real way of finding out is this true or not, right? So I think those are some key things that are kind of leading this, and I think generally when the economy is feeling stressed for a lot of people will always worry about their share of the pie. So I think it is natural that people get a little Hobbesian and worried about scarcity and thinking maybe it's not the right time to bring in people when I'm struggling itself.
Kate, it's interesting that when you look at the growing reason why people have a dissatisfaction with immigration and think there's too many people is they place the blame on the system being poorly managed by government, and that has made it harder for jobs, harder for housing, harder in a lot of places. And, I just wonder what your thoughts are on what we're seeing in this data.
Yeah, I think some of those more troubling statistics that you see around, whether or not immigrants contribute to criminal activity or where people are coming from, and some of those more troubling statistics in the report, a lot of that is ultimately rooted in a distrust in the credibility of the system. And that falls pretty squarely on the previous government, who really opened the doors. And, we're now seeing, the Carney administration try to put the puzzle back together. But we had such a consensus in this country for so long around immigration that became broken under the last government. And so even, tinkering with the margins around international students or low-skilled non-permanent residents, that's going to take a while for Canadians to feel that is appearing in their communities, that they're seeing that change when it comes to accessing healthcare or housing. So there's a long game there. And I think what you're seeing, David, in these results is the long tail of a mismanaged system that has caused a lot of Canadians to really question whether or not the government before if they were asleep at the switch, and whether or not the current one is in a position to actually correct a lot of those challenges.
Well, look, if you work in a college or a university in Canada, you're feeling it now, right? Because a big part of the push for the federal government to allow so many more students come in was funding cuts at provincial levels, tuition freezes, and then them turning to international students for the higher tuition rates they could charge, and now that has been cut off. But Brad, those troubling statistics that Kate mentioned, 36% agree that immigrants increase the level of crime in Canada. Not a majority, but that's not an insignificant share of the population. And 39% believe that the country accepts too many immigrants from racial minority groups. That is, you look at that, some alarm bells go off.
No kidding. Yeah, lots of alarm bells go off. Particularly on those last two stats, and those numbers are up from the last time this issue was polled by these folks. So we're moving in the wrong direction, and that's a problem. The issue, I think, is and I agree with the comments about that. There's been I think Canadians have been shaken by mismanagement, and not to be overly partisan, but there's no question that when you take a look at the levels of intake that Mark Miller and Justin Trudeau did during Miller's time as immigration minister and Trudeau's time as prime minister, the consensus was based on the fact that immigration is seen as both an economic and a social value to our communities across this country. And then when the intake was such that a lot of people said, we don't have housing, infrastructure, places in K-12 education, we don't have all of the social things for these folks, and they started to, I think, see, even when you mentioned college and university, having in Brampton, just outside of Toronto, having 15, 20 students live in one, apartment house. Just these are not what Canadians want to see their immigration system do. A lot of people took advantage of the system. A lot of these private colleges were cash cows, and the lag is the challenge, right? So there's been, the government says there's been a course correction, but we're not observing the course correction, just like we didn't see the immediate impacts of the intake at the time. Now we're not seeing the impacts of the course correction, and that's going to take some time. And I think the government's got some work to do to educate Canadians on what it is, particularly within the categories, within the variety of streams. Canadians don't debate the merits of the various streams. They just see that the infrastructure can't withstand it. Services aren't there for them. Why is that the case? it's very easy for some politicians to say that's because we took in too many immigrants under Justin Trudeau. I think there's a disservice to the immigrant community. It does also a disservice to the consensus that we had that we have to get back to.
I think that everybody's made really good points looking back at why we got to where we are now. But not to be Pollyannish, but I do take some heart in the numbers that were looked at, because at least they've said that 8 in 10 Canadians believe that people born abroad are as likely as native-born Canadians to be good citizens. So that's a majority of Canadians, and I think that it's too easy to say that the consensus is broken. It's under tremendous strain, and I think those numbers are obvious. What it both is an indictment of the past government's sort of rush to open the floodgates and a belated course correction, as Brad points out. But I think it also represents a big challenge for this government to get its immigration game in order, because they have a weak minister in the House of Commons who's getting her lunch eaten every day whenever she gets asked a question. And coming up, we have, I guess the revelation of what the government's plans will be on immigration going forward. We get this every year, right? And so are they going to stick to the Trudeau plan or will they adjust in any way?
Usually by Halloween, right? Like October 31st.
Exactly. Usually it's like end October, early November. So that's coming up. And I think that it behooves this government to work very hard to make sure that not just the political dialogue around immigration is supportive of the view of immigration as a positive force for our economy and society, but also to get its policy act in order. And I guess, time will tell.
Yeah, look, the buck ultimately stops with the federal government because they have to approve everything. But you saw, like something like Conestoga College had in 2024 23,000 international students registered at a private. Now they're down to about 8,000, right? You just saw these. So there's pressure at the provincial level. It was poorly done in a lot of ways. And Kate, I just wonder about the political polarization. More than 80%, about 82% of Conservative voters versus 40% Liberal, 30% NDP. This widening on this issue. When issues get polarized like that, the arguments go to the polls, right? And it becomes harder to have a sensible conversation, What are your thoughts on that? Do you worry that this could drive sort of the conversation about this to the edges of sort of the political extremes here?
I think politicians of all parties, including the Conservatives, have a responsibility to keep the conversation focused on data and focused on the programs and holding the government to account, and not, giving credence to some of that more xenophobic expression that seems to be manifesting in this particular study. I do think that the Conservatives have done a very good job keeping focused on that. They focused on challenges with the temporary foreign workers program. To Tonda's point, there's a number of challenges that are brought forward every day to the minister. And so I think Conservatives are talking about immigration. They are right to. The message here is to not stop talking about an issue that is hugely resonant with a significant number of Canadians, not just their voters. But it's important to keep it facts-based and evidence-based. This is a concern for a lot of people in their communities in terms of the impact on social services and on, access to healthcare and education and housing, et cetera. So I think Conservatives are right to talk about it, and they're right to keep sticking to the facts as they have been.
Right. So Vandana, on that, as Kay pointed out, a lot of the, no way suggesting that the Conservative-Liberal split is because of a xenophobia in any direction, because the Conservative political messaging has been about a poorly run system and too much pressure on housing and schools and everything. So what does the new government, as the Mark Carney team likes to call itself, what do they need to do on this issue going forward to make sure that this fraying consensus does ultimately hold together despite the polarization we may be seeing?
Yeah, one thing, just to touch on the polarization piece again, I sat through a lot of focus groups in the campaign, and I'd be curious as to when those people became Conservatives. And I think it's also, is it just last few years where Mr. Poilievre's message was resonating? Is it when things were getting a little out of flux? So I'd be curious as to, are these necessarily like lifelong party members, or have they become recently coming here, struggling, join the party because they like the message? So I think that is something to kind of think through, because that's more about what's happening today rather than the party itself. On what to do, we talked a lot about what's happening with immigration, why did it take place, but we do talk about what's happening now and what do we do with people who are here. And I think we have a lot of students who came here under false pretenses. Not that they came under false pretenses, but they were sold something that they don't have access to now. They came, their families sometimes gave up everything to hoping to get a good education in Canada. You have a lot of people who want to work, and I think the government has to put forward a plan of how do we help settle people? How do we help get jobs? How do we help get housing? How do we get people to work? Because if every Canadian who's able to be able to work and contribute to the economy, it makes a stronger economy. So I think the plan can't just be what is going to happen now. Okay, we're going to cut down the levels, but how are we going to help those who are here so that people don't feel that anxiety about what's happening today, and that education piece as to what is real versus what is just social media sharing. And I think it's important for them to talk about that and tack that head on.
All right, Brad, quick thoughts from you, and then Tanda, and then we got to say goodbye.
Yeah, I think it's okay for this federal government to begin to communicate a lot better. Not only, we talked about their inability to communicate on a number of files, and this is among them. This is one of them because it's one of the vulnerabilities that they are vulnerable to on the Conservative side of things. In the absence of a strong NDP in the House of Commons, the Conservatives are going to have an easier time in setting the agenda in driving things like crime and like immigration. It's okay for the Liberals to say that we're going to clamp down on the bad actors, on those that are luring new Canadians here under false pretenses or abusing the system. Crack down on it to give confidence into the institution so that we don't turn into what's happening currently in the States, where people are cheering on ICE to send home people in America, or what we're seeing in Europe with the anti-immigrant sentiment far along than we are in Canada. We don't want to go anywhere near there. It's time to clamp it down now.
Tanda?
Yeah, no, I agree with the point that it's on all the policymakers and politicians to keep their rhetoric focused on policy and less perhaps dog whistling to any quarter they wish to convene. I think that's where the political responsibility lies.
Okay, we got to leave it there. It's a good conversation. Tanda McCharles, Vanda Nakadar, Kate Harrison, and Brad Levine, thank you all so much.